Cool. Thank you all for coming. Normally I would be standing, but I'm afraid that I will start to be trapped if I stand up. So forgive me for doing an introduction while sitting. So I'm Professor Lemons, and I'm very excited that you all have come in person. That's great. Good to see some faces. Also, thank you to all of you who are here in Zoom. Before we begin, I just wanted to mention two more upcoming events. We have on Thursday, March 31st, from 11:30 to 12:30 during the Common Hour. We have another seminar coming up. It's on Zoom. It's by Dr. Baran from the University of Iowa. The title of her talk is Using Z's to Understand the ABCs of Mental Health. So that's going to be solely on Zoom. Also coming up on April 2nd, we have an Assumption team of students and staff forming this Assumption team for an MS walk event. So this is an event just to raise awareness about MS, to raise fundraising to help those who are afflicted with MS or multiple sclerosis. It's on Saturday morning at 10 a.m. just at the Worcester Technical High School. It's only a 1.5 mile walk. It's not a strenuous walk. In fact, in the past, it's been quite lovely. The first 20 students to sign up on the Team Assumption site and show up get a free t-shirt. And we're going to meet here in the Testa Atrium at 9:30, have a few donuts and a little bit of coffee, and we're going to carpool over to the walk. So there are some flyers in Testa and also on the portal with a link of how to join the team, should you be interested. And today, I'm very excited that we have a seminar speaker from our own Assumption University Philosophy Department. And I'm going to ask Professor Maher, wherever he went, to give an introduction. Thanks again for coming.
Yeah, well, looking at me.
You have to go steal it. You have to go find it in the track.
Okay. No, not going to work. All right, we'll do our best here. So anyway, I'm very glad to be here. I'm very glad to introduce our speaker. It's a fact about this place that we happen to be very fortunate. We attract people who have something to say. If you've been around Assumption for a long time, you've had this experience. We have all kinds of people. One of the problems, though, is that they can be hidden. We have them, they're over here, over there teaching. We don't have an opportunity to hear from them directly. Sometimes it happens, as is the case with our own present speaker. He's been with us for a couple of years now, but it's really my first opportunity to hear him speak on the topic that's actually his specialty. And so I'm very excited about this opportunity. I first met with him in person about 2 years ago. He was teaching then at Emmanuel College. And I was over there visiting, and we spent some time together that day. And a lot of what I learned about him that day led me to want to bring him here and have him teach for us, which he's been doing for the past 2 years. But I think I spent more time in person with him that day than I've spent since. And that's COVID, right? COVID has interfered with our ability to have these kinds of conversations and meetings. And today, for me personally, this is the first time I've been part of an event here on campus, I think, since all of this started. And so I'm glad of that too. It's an opportunity, it's a privilege to be together and to be able to talk about serious ideas. And I'm very glad to introduce our speaker, who's going to give us something to think about. He comes to us with an education from Colorado State and from the University of Iowa, where he wrote a dissertation on skepticism, the difficulty of knowing things. He's published a little bit on that and done some work on it. He's also really, why he's here today is because he has studied and addressed and argued and written in defense of an area in the philosophy of perception known as inactivism that many of you from in my class will recognize that name. We've talked about it a little bit. Effectively, it brings about the idea that our perceptual engagement with the world is a kind of activity where we're bodily working with and on and around in the world. And so it's a very interesting area in neuroscience. As I say, he's published in this area in places like the Journal of Mind and Behavior, South African Journal of Philosophy. He's got a book manuscript dealing with this. I believe the current working title, Existential and Activism. Is that still correct? Existential and Activism. and that's under contract with Palgrave Macmillan. He's taught a great deal in the area since he finished his schooling at Iowa, Emmanuel College, Providence College, UMass Dartmouth, here for the last 2 years, some time ago at Colorado State. He's done a number of presentations, public talks, and discussions in the area, much on ethics and medical ethics, even recently on COVID ethics and vaccine distributions and questions like that. One of his talks, which I know he's working on a paper on this topic, but it's again, for those of you who've been in my class, you'll recognize how this title might be interesting. What is it like to be a hallucinating bat? I'd like to read that one, but I haven't yet. Tonight, we're going to hear on the topic of the living brain, how existential phenomenology informs cognitive neuroscience. Please welcome Kaplan Hasanoglu.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Dan. That was a very nice introduction. Thanks to Dr. Lemons and Dr. Maher for organizing this, and Jackie for promoting it like crazy. I saw many more pictures of myself around campus than I'm normally comfortable seeing, but it was nice to have the opportunity to do this, and nice to see everybody here in person and virtually. So I'm going to talk today about how I think existential phenomenology, and I want to get this going here. I want to talk today about how existential phenomenology can inform cognitive neuroscience. And so the plan, as you can see, is first, Dr. Lemons asked me to speak a little bit about my background, which I'm, sort of reluctant and scared to do at the same time. But I'll try to speak a little bit about what brought me to talk about these and think about these issues. And then I'll say just a this is going to be the heaviest lift of the talk, is I'm going to say as much as I can in a short amount of time about what existential phenomenology is. I'll talk a little bit about Martin Heidegger's view of the human self as it relates to existential phenomenology, and that's going to be the sort of densest, most longest portion of the talk. And then I'm going to give a sort of equally brief understanding of one relevant aspect of cognitive neuroscience that relates to perception and action. And those are going to sort of be two freestanding talks, and you're not going to know what one has to do with the other. And then the rest of the talk is supposed to explain what one has to do with the other. And I'll do two things. I'm going to describe how existential phenomenology can inform cognitive neurosciences in a negative way. And that is how it could sort of say how current neuroscience could be corrected. That's what makes it a negative part of the talk. And I'll talk about this, this provocative, I hope, idea of the existentially guilty brain. We'll talk about what that means. And then I'll also give a positive aspect of how existential phenomenology relates to cognitive neuroscience. And that's where I'll talk about what I will call the authentic brain and its relationship to neuroplasticity. So let's begin. So I will try to be as brief as possible here. These are just some people who are important in my life. I have my parents up top there, and then I have me with some students at a social event years ago. And these are my teachers that are very important, sort of role models and mentors. And so my background started in philosophy, and I owe it to my parents, I suppose. Both of my parents are philosophical, but I'd say they're sort of unwitting philosophers. My father has a lot of interests in time and metaphysics and death, frankly. He talks a lot about these issues. He's interested in that. My mother has all sorts of interests in all sorts of fields, and she's sort of pluralistic like me, in that we, like to be a dabbler in all sorts of things: music, philosophy, medicine. And so she, I think, had a sort of, effect on how I think about philosophy today in ways that you can't really put your finger on it. That'll very much relate to Heidegger's view of the self. So their influence is there. But if I had to articulate exactly how it's there, it might be difficult. But I just wanted to point out that my interest in science and my interest in philosophy is owed to my parents. And my interest in philosophy started with this man on the lower left, Lee Spear. He passed away in 2007. And I don't know if I should like praise him or blame him for everything, but like he is the reason. And so, you know, he is the reason why I'm here for sure. Took a philosophy class and it was just like eye-opening, and I was never the same after that. And I knew I wanted to do this basically, and it was because of him. He's a great man, very, very nice person, took me under his wing all throughout my undergraduate career and while I did my master's degree at Colorado State. The next gentleman, Jim Maffey, he's over at University of Maryland right now, College Park, and he was at Colorado State at the time, and he did work with me in epistemology, which is this field that tries to get at the nature of knowledge. And for him, it has a lot to do with science. So he was where I definitely got this idea that science and philosophy should be mutually informative, and that if you're a scientist, you should be doing philosophy, and if you're a philosopher, you should be doing science. This is my view. Definitely owe it to Jim for that. And then Evan Fales is the last person on the right there. He was somebody who led my dissertation, and that kind of leads me to where this stuff came about, because my work, as Dr. Maher mentioned, was in the skeptical problem, which is this very sort of heady intellectual question about whether or not we know anything, where there's philosophical arguments that say that we can know nothing. Okay, and I never really liked that, and it's sort of the point of it is that you're not supposed to like it, but I always tried to work around it. And the way that I eventually came to work around it was by realizing that whether or not I know something has to do with what my eyes are doing and what my ears are doing and what my body is doing, right? And so if you think about it like this, if my nature of my perceptual experience is all I can know about are my own private thoughts, well, then I don't know anything. I don't know that there's a chair here, that you're here, anything, right? But the flip side of that is that if I look at perceptual experience and it involves you all as constituents, like there would be no experience right now if you weren't there, right? Well, then if that view of perceptual experience is correct, then perhaps I know a great deal. Okay, and so that led me to look into whether scientific ways of looking at things can help answer the question of the nature of perceptual experience. And so that was the sort of short story about how it was led to cognitive neurosciences. I wanted to get a good understanding of what perceptual experience was like to help me answer that basic question about what we can and cannot know. Okay, so I could go on for a while about that, but I'm gonna sort of resist the urge to do so. Let's see here. So so that led me to this idea. So now what I'm gonna do is do two things: explain existential phenomenology very quickly, this is a tall order, and then explain the relevant versions of cognitive neurosciences, and then explain how they should mutually inform one another, where I'm going to talk most specifically about how existential phenomenology should mutually inform neuroscience. So it all starts with that's Martin Heidegger and his views of the self. I've sort of become obsessed with Martin Heidegger lately, and his book, The Being in Time. It's one of the most important books of the 20th century. It's also almost impossible to read and very difficult. And so I oftentimes read it and reread it and ask myself, whether I should be doing that and what I should be getting out of it. But he's very influential for a reason, because he has a very specific understanding of the human self. Okay, and this is what I think is important for cognitive neuroscience. It's this idea that human beings are self-interpreting beings, okay? So you may have heard of the existentialist idea that our existence precedes our essence. This is his way of talking about that, and his way of understanding this idea that our existence precedes our essence. So what does it mean? Well, we can sort of summarize it as follows. By virtue of the fact that you are an cultured, intelligent human being who grew up in this particular culture, you have at any given time, including now, a series of normative claims that can be made upon you that determine what matters to you at the moment. Okay? And he calls it a case of thrownness, because the things that matter to you and the normative claims that are made upon you right now are things that you have inherited, whether you like it or not, in this moment. Okay, and so the analogy is you're sort of thrown into this moment. Well, imagine you were thrown in the air, right? And you had to deal with the fact that you were thrown in the air, right? Well, the normative claims made on you and what matters to you is something thrown like that. And what it means to be a human being is to have to deal with your life and deal with yourself in light of the things that matter to you at the moment that are not in your control, and you have to do something. And the key existentialist idea that says the existence precedes your essence is that you have nothing to appeal to help you deal with the things that have a normative claim on you. You cannot appeal to God. Okay, God on this view will not help you figure out how to deal with the things that matter to you in the moment. You cannot appeal to human nature. You cannot appeal to reason. So this is one of the ways in which existential phenomenology is very alien to a lot of traditional philosophical views, which traditional philosophical views argue that if you're looking for things to do to guide you, say to the good life, you can appeal to reason. Existential phenomenologists deny that. So let me just give you an example to illustrate this idea, because those ideas of normative claims and all that and mattering might be difficult to understand. So I'll talk about myself. I am a father right now, and I am a teacher right now. Okay, and that is an aspect about me and who I am at this moment that I cannot change at this moment. I am a father right now, whether I like it or not, right? And I am a teacher right now, whether I like it or not. Now, by virtue of the fact that I am a father, various things matter to me. My children, right? My income, and so on and so forth, right? And so the fact that I'm a father shapes my experience right now, and it shapes how I feel, very in a real sense, because it shapes what matters to me because I'm a father. All right. But I'm also a teacher, right? And because I'm a teacher at the moment, right? And this has nothing to do with the profession, by the way. It has to do with who I am. I'm a teacher, whether I like it or not, right? And by virtue of being a teacher, various things matter to me, right? For example, making myself clear to the people here and at home matters to me because of being a teacher. How I finish this sentence matters to me by virtue of the fact that I'm a teacher. Okay, and to say that I'm thrown is to say that I cannot control the fact that both of those things and other things have a normative claim on me, where that just means I feel like I'm obligated to do this or that, including finish the sentence well, be clear, make enough income to support my family, and so forth. But how do I address the fact that those things have that claim on me? Nobody has a guide. Nobody can guide me. Okay. I can't appeal to God's will to do that. I cannot appeal to human nature to do it. I cannot appeal to reason to do it. I cannot appeal to anything to do it. All I have is myself. This is the argument. Now, so why would that matter, or how would that, come up? I mean, right now, nothing about being a teacher is in conflict with being a father. You know what I mean? No offense, I'd rather be home with my kid right now, but I don't feel like I'm being a bad father by being here, right? But what if it's like Saturday morning, right? And I have the opportunity to spend time with my kid, or I have the opportunity to get through the pile of work that I have, or work on the book, right? And it's Saturday morning, I have that free time to do that. And I walk down the stairs, and there's my kid over there in the playroom, and there's the computer over there beckoning me to work, right? Well, there's a tension. There's a tension between what I should do as a father versus what I should do as a teacher. And I need to figure it out. Even if I go back up to bed, that's still something I've done, you see? Or if I go like this, I don't have to do anything, that's still something I've done, right? Or I have to choose going to my kid and playing, or going to work, right? Or something in the middle, but I have to do it. Do you see the point? That's the idea. And so to be self-interpreting just means to be the only one responsible for figuring out what to do in those very situations. And the idea is nothing else can guide me other than myself. Okay, that's the idea. And now, so there's a couple of different ways to sort of proceed in interpreting that mattered for Heidegger. These are generic ways of proceeding. You can so proceed in light of all those normative claims in situations where you have to sort out what to do given those conflicts. You can do it in an inauthentic way, or you can do it in an authentic way. Okay? If you do it in an inauthentic way, all you do is you respond to the situations that tell you what to do in the way that would be expected of you, or the ways that would be expected of you, the set of ways, right? So you just act the way that people in our culture would be expected to act, right? It doesn't mean our culture tells us the one thing to do, but there are things that our culture says that are acceptable. And then there are things that in our culture that says that are not acceptable, right? If I respond to what I should do by just appealing to what everybody else is doing or would do, right? And then I'm acting inauthentically. The way to think about it is when you behave inauthentically, you respond to a general situation in a general way, right? So now I'm no longer, down the stairs staring at my kid versus my computer. Now I'm in the elevator. This is a good example, right? So you're in the elevator. And when you're in the elevator, you get into these situations where you're sort of forced to interact with people, right? And so there's a question of how do you respond when you get into the elevator and somebody comes in? Well, if you were behaving inauthentically, you would say, there's a general way that one responds when they're in the elevator. And so and this is that kind of case, so I'm going to respond the general way. Nod, whatever it is, right? Everyone looks at their phone, right? Ignoring people and look at my phone, right? You ask what floor, and so it goes, right? Okay. So that would be to respond to the general situation. I'm in an elevator and somebody came in the generally acceptable way. Okay. To behave authentically, by contrast, is to behave in a way that seizes upon the fact that you are not just a carbon copy of everybody in your culture, but seizes on the fact that you are a unique individual. Okay? And so I'll say a little bit more about what it involves, but the idea would be, rather than responding to the general situation in the general way, when you behave authentically, you respond to the specific situation in a very specific way that is appropriate for you, given your thrownness, basically, given everything about you that you've inherited that makes you have to act in that moment. So you have a particular vantage point in the elevator. You have a particular line of sights. You have a particular history that gives you certain dispositions regarding how to act in that moment, right? And if somebody who's authentic is alive to all of the specific things about the situation, rather than treating it in a very generic way, right? And they are aware of those specific aspects of the situation, and they respond to that specific situation in a very specific way. Now, I want to be clear. It doesn't mean you have to do like a weird thing in the elevator, like a little dance or something like that, or say a witty remark. It doesn't require that. You can still look at your phone. You can still say what floor. You can say how you doing, that kind of thing, right? But the difference is what motivates you to act that way, you see, and how you do it. So for existentialists, it's not what you do, and they're not, when they say be authentic, this is important. They're not saying like be a bit of a weirdo. That's not what they're saying. They're saying be a person that responds to the fact that you are a unique person. Be an individual, okay, and act accordingly. All right. So I'm already sort of over time here, but that's okay. Well, I'm actually doing okay. I want to get at a very specific recipe for being authentic, okay, and then explain why we ought to be authentic. So there's a very specific recipe for being authentic. And it has to do with a recognition of the kind of thing that you are as a sort of finite human being that must deal with itself, that must self-interpret. And it relates to these very peculiar notions of guilt and death in an existentialist sense. Okay, so we'll start with guilt, right? We normally think of guilt in the kind of legal or moral sense, right? Where that involves you acting towards another person in a way that is somehow inadequate. That's what makes you guilty, right? You shouldn't have done that, and so you acted on bad reasons when you did something to someone and it was morally or legally guilty. Existential guilt is the sort of background way that you are that makes that more specific kind of guilt possible. Okay, so let me explain that a little bit. To be existentially guilty just means to be something that is thrown, something that has to self-interpret in light of the fact that it is thrown, where the thing that you can't do is rely on any sort of guide. So it means you have to act always for inadequate reasons. That's the point, right? So if I'm morally guilty, I act for inadequate reasons, and that's why I'm to blame, right? Well, to be existentially guilty is to be something that is built into your condition as a human being to always have to act for inadequate reasons. Right now, I have various normative claims on me, right? And if I look for anything to guide me, it won't be there. This is the idea. And there is no one way to act that I can find. And yet, I still have to figure it out. Right? And so no matter what I do, it has to be existentially guilty because it has to be done for inadequate reasons. I mean, the best example of this is if you are a conformist, right? If you act in a way that just appeals to the norms of your culture, and that's the reason why you do it, I hope everybody in this room recognizes why that's a bad reason to act. If all you're doing is following people, and that's the reason why you do everything, then that's an example of existential guilt because it's a highly inadequate reason to act. You know, I mean, think if you're greeting somebody and you greet them by whatever it is, shaking hands, although that's going out of the way in this post-pandemic world. We're not going to shake hands anymore, are we? It's kind of gross, right? But the idea is, but you're shaking hands or you're kissing cheeks, whatever it is in our culture. Well, suppose you're like, oh, what should I do? I'm going to shake their hand. No one in this room thinks shaking hands is the right way to act in some like objective, sense, where like the idea would be, oh, those people kiss cheeks, what a bunch of weirdos. We all recognize the cultural relativity of shaking hands when we greet people, I hope, right? It's just something that we do, right? Well, to be existentially guilty is to have nothing other than something that flimsy to fall back on. You see this idea? And all you can do is fall back on the normal way of behaving, and that's palpably inadequate, and that's what it means to be existentially guilty. So now death. Let's talk about death, right? Existential death is just like the relationship between moral and legal guilt and existential guilt. Existential death is related to our normal understanding of death, which treats normal understanding of death as a special case. All right, so what do I mean by that? Well, when humans die, it's different from when like a plant dies, or different from when even like a dog dies or something like that. So humans dying has a different kind of significance than any of those things dying, right? And so what is it about human death that would make it different? Well, go back to the idea that you are thrown in a way that things matter, and then they have a normative claim on you. Well, if you think about it, for each of you in this room, there's a sort of most generic set of normative claims on you at any given time, and it sort of organizes your behavior. I mean, I gave you my example, father and teacher, right? No matter what, those things, because they sort of define who I am, right? Father and teacher, they always have that normative claim upon me. And so as a result, they organize my behavior. I mean, I already talked about why. Things matter right now because I'm a father. Things matter right now because I'm a teacher, and it shapes how I think, how I act, what rooms I walk into, how I speak, and so on and so forth, right? So because of that thrownness and those normative claims being made on you, I have what he calls a world, right? The world of being a father, the world of being a teacher, as I experience things, right? Because of the way things matter to me, the world is shaped by that stuff, okay? So existential death is just the recognition that all of that stuff hangs by a thread, okay? Something could happen to my family or my son, which makes me no longer a father, right? That could happen at any given time, yes? Something could happen to me right now. I mean, I had a colleague who suffered from a brain injury very recently, and it's like, that could be me. Right? Well, if that happens to me, if it's bad enough, I'm no longer a teacher. Yes? Right? And so there's a vulnerability to who I am as a teacher and as a father, right? And that vulnerability is the vulnerability of what you might call a world collapse. Think about somebody who has to go through a divorce. When they go through a divorce, their entire world is changed. Everything is different. Okay? Well, that's existential death. If you have to go through something life-changing like that. Okay? Because your world would collapse. Okay? And now, so there's a sort of vulnerability built into being human as a result. Okay. And obviously, biological death is just a special case of that. Because when you actually croak, right, your world's going to collapse too, right? So biological death is just a special case of existential death. But existential death could happen long before biological death if your world collapses in the meantime. Okay. So now, why am I saying both of these things? Just to lighten the mood here and make you feel really good about yourself. Right? That's fine. No, the reason why I'm saying both of those things is to be an authentic person, you have to face up to both existential guilt and existential death. Okay? And not shy away from either of them. Okay? You have to face up to the fact that you have no guide as far as how you should behave. And really, if you really examine how you're doing, you're just floundering about. Right? And if you think you have a good plan, you're kidding yourself in a way that leads to inauthenticity. You know, when students say to me, I don't know what I'm going to do with my life, I always say, like, that's the most honest way to approach this. How could you know what you're going to do with your life? You're 18, right? Right? Thinking that you know what you're going to do with your life is an example, I would argue, of being inauthentic. Because you think there's a path for you, there isn't a path, right? Okay. And so facing up to that. Facing up to the fact that your world could collapse at any moment, right? Not shying away from it. And to be an authentic person, then, is to face all of that and use it to your advantage, so to speak, to respond to the specific situation in the specific way and act accordingly. The thing that's going to happen is you're going to feel anxiety. You're going to feel anxiety about how you have nothing to go on but your thrownness, and your thrownness can't give you any sort of real guide. You're going to feel anxiety about how your entire world could collapse at any moment. All right. And the idea of being authentic is to say, yeah, but that's what it means to be human, and not shy away from that and use it as a way to change how you look at the world. Right. And it's going to be the thing that allows you to respond to a specific situation in a specific way. That's the argument. Okay. All right. So I'm way over time. Completely different thing. Completely different thing. But I mean, I wanted to actually explain it. It's hard to, right? All right, completely different way of thinking and way of talking. So this is going to be where I can sort of rely on my notes here. This is from the book manuscript. All right, and I'll sort of use this as my crutch here just in case I need it. I probably won't, but who knows. So I'm going to give you a sort of question. What the heck does that have to do with cognitive neuroscience, right? Okay. So let me explain cognitive neuroscience first, and then I'll try to explain what it has to do with it in one way, shape, or form. So I'm just going to talk about perceptual experience. The thing that I'm talking about applies when I talk about the relevant stuff, and I talk about how existentialism applies to it. I think it applies to much more than perceptual experience, but I'm just going to use that to keep things simple. And so according to the current understanding in cognitive neuroscience, perceptual experiences are computations performed by the brain sort of below consciousness, okay? And it sort of happens behind the scenes, right? And it looks at sensation as a kind of transduction. So let me explain that, right? Well, look at right now, right? I'm just going to give you some cognitive neuroscience right now. As you read that line, it says computations performed by the. Read it right now, and have you noticed that it is very clear, okay, I'm assuming, but while you're looking at computations performed by the other lines are comparatively blurry, aren't they? Focus on it, right? Why is that, right? In the broadest of terms, it's because we discriminate the visible world around us via a sensory apparatus that's built a certain way, okay? For example, for those who are able to see that clearly, right? You're only able to do that because of your fovea or your foci, right? Which are the areas towards the center of our retinas where the photoreceptors are densely packed. So part of the reason why, when you look at that, adjacent lines are blurry is because the fovea actually takes up 1% of your entire retinal surface. And it's the equivalent of the size of your thumbnail when it's viewed at arm's length. The area of your retina that's most densely packed is that small, okay? So zooming out a bit, you also know that when the light that bounces off nearby objects hits you, the images projected on it are left, right, and up, down, reversed. So when you see, if you were to see the projection of this on your retina, it would be reversed that way and upside down. And that's what's hitting your retina at this moment. Okay. What happens inside the brain? So the idea is cognitive neuroscience says this, right? You start with a kind of meager projection, almost confused projection of that sort, left, right, and up, down, reverse through the fovea. And the idea is from that meager input, you get your conscious experience. You get the conscious experience. And the claim is your brain is the thing that changes that and makes it so that you start with the projection, left, right, and up, down, reverse, and you get this, what you now see, right? So what happens, right? In a typical adult, it's well established that various neuronal ensembles differentially respond in both direct and indirect ways to light hitting the retina. The response at the sensory periphery is a form of transduction. So this is this idea of sensation as transduction. The nervous system reliably and repeatedly makes it so that light striking your retinas causes a stereotypical neuronal or retinal event. The transduction of moving from a light rays to a neuronal event, that's crucial for intelligence, okay? It provides you with a biologically cost-effective way to exploit the strong correlation between patterns of light and the way things tend to be around you. So for example, in a typical environment, right, a small area of contrasting light, so maybe, like this, right? It either means that a small object is close by or a relatively big object is far away. If it's a small point of contrasting light, maybe it's a gnat that's nearby you, or it's a mountain that's really far away, right? But it doesn't tend to mean that there's a large object nearby, right? It doesn't tend to mean that, a small area of contrasting light. And so that's an example of how transduction activity can relate to how things are likely to be in your surroundings, right? Small point of light likely is not a big object nearby, right? That's the idea, right? So these events at the sensory periphery, they're not the source of a unidirectional signal. So this is going to matter for my purposes, okay? Your retinas do not function like camera lenses, okay? And that's a bad analogy, and that's a bad metaphor if you think about your retinas as camera lenses. Instead, that narrowing down of possibilities, small point of light, can't be a big object nearby, right? That's performed by the entire nervous system. Given how retinal activity is reciprocally integrated, both with similar activity along the retinal surface, as well as a host of activity inside the brain. So what does that mean? It means if we were going to isolate a certain group of photoreceptors on your retina right now, and we were sort of looking at the transduction activity of that over time, okay, that transduction activity over time would be affecting the activity of other areas of your brain and other areas of the retina at that same time, and vice versa. And vice versa. So right now, the activity in other areas of the brain and other areas of the retina, it's affecting how the neurons are firing, so to speak, at this particular point in your retina. Okay, it's kind of a reciprocal integration. This is this idea. Okay. Now, modern cognitive so you can say the boundary lines of like the areas that are and are not affected in the way I was just talking about, they're unclear, they're a little blurry, and it's partly conventional. But the idea is the visual system is the overall area involved in that kind of reciprocal integration, where it's a piece affected by the retina and itself affecting the retina at the same time. That big sort of piece of the brain, that's the visual system. So modern cognitive neuroscience claims that the visual system is what is primarily responsible for visual intelligence, seeing things like you can right now, being able to recognize objects in the way that you can, and so on and so forth, right? Although highly integrated, various neuronal ensembles within the visual system are functionally distinguished from one another vis-a-vis the specific role they play in narrowing down those possibilities. So you get these fascinating cases of subjects with brain lesions, right? Who have certain areas of visual intelligence, but not others. So the classic example of this is blind sight. So these are patients, they have something wrong with their brain, either suffered some injury or maybe it was congenital. There's different cases of this, but they will report being unable to consciously see an object before them, or at least consciously recognize it. Okay, but if you ask them to reach for it and somehow manipulate it, they can do that just fine. Or if you say, what side is the object on? They say, I don't know, I can't see any object. Is it on your left side or your right side? I don't know, I can't see the object. Well, why don't you just guess and point at where it is? And they say, okay, I can't see it, but I think it's there. And they've shown that they are it's highly reliable. They know how to point to it, even though they can't see it, right? And they can't consciously see it. So cases like that suggest that the brain divides the labor of the visual system. Our intelligent visual experiences, beliefs, and actions are the activity of a variety of subsystems, or what you might call modules. Okay, we know, so here's the sort of kicker. We know that distinct areas in the human brain, distinct areas, are necessary for the visual detection of edges, form, color, motion, and depth, facial recognition, and more. Okay, these different modules are also hierarchically organized, so the failure or deterioration of one subsystem can affect that of the other, but not necessarily vice versa. So, for example, early visual detection of edges, all right, is necessary for shape detection. You can't detect a shape like this, right, unless you can detect something like this, the edge. Everyone got that, right? But the opposite isn't as true. If you can't detect a shape, maybe that part is damaged, you still could detect edges. Okay, so that's an example of hierarchical organization. Shape detection depends on edge detection, but not vice versa. Okay, so this basic, so I guess there's other things to say, just real quick. Right, these are hierarchical and modular organization. That's what I was just talking about. And there's also parallel processing, right? As macro ensembles of these systems, they operate in parallel. So there's the visual system. It's operating in parallel with what is responsible for hearing. Okay, so it's distinct yet similarly integrated systems in the brain are responsible for other forms of intelligence. And all that's going on right now, right? Your visual intelligence is happening right now, but you're hearing me as well. And so you have auditory intelligence as well. Okay, so this basic picture survives to this day, and it's understood in terms of unconscious inference and computational processes, right? Now, so I'm going to try to, since I'm running low on time already, I'm going to try to be a little bit quicker with this, right? The basic idea is that your brain operates so that it moves from sparse information to rich information via the kind of activity of the sort I was talking about, via those different modules, right? So if you want to think about it one way, and this is the sort of bottom-up picture, this is the classical picture of things. It's not as accepted today, but this is what people are used to think. I'm thinking of like David Maher here, for example. The idea would be you have early processing of edges, okay, and your brain concludes, it says, if I'm firing such that I have 4 edges connected like this, then the next part of my brain should fire so that there's a square present. Okay, so the idea is the brain moves from sparse information about edges to something richer and more informative about shape. Okay, and the claim is, the classical picture that's now rejected was, the reason why you get this, this perspectival experience is you start with the meager inputs, the up, down, and left, right, reverse, just light striking your retina, and then this neural ensemble fires, and then it operates according to the principle, well, if this, then this, if edges, then square, and so the idea is the brain adds information. From meager information about edges, you get a richer piece of information about squares. And then you move through that kind of process until you get the richest experience possible for you, which is this. Okay, that's the idea. So that's all bottom up. But the modern, or I guess it's an en vogue view is more top down. So this is the idea that it's not so much that your brain builds up a representation from the bottom up from meager input and then gets to a rich experience from there. It's that you start with a kind of memory or stored model of things, okay? And you use that model to make predictions about what you would expect to see with your eyes, what kind of neural events you would expect to see. This is sort of a foolish example, but the idea would be, in this context, but the idea would be, if you were in a situation where you would expect to see squares, right? then the brain would say, given that it's very likely that a square is present, neurons or retinas, you should be firing so that edges are present. Straight edges, right? And so it's top down in the sense that you start with a model that makes predictions about what stimulations you will receive, okay? And then the idea is, what does the retina do? It sends information from the bottom up, but what it sends is information regarding whether or not what is expected is actually happening, right? So the idea would be your brain is telling your eyes, expect edges, expect straight edges, because it's very likely that a square is present. And your eyes are sending information back to the brain. Well, we see edges, everything's cool. We see edges, but sometimes, right, what happens is unexpected, right? And that's what an illusion might be that you sort of discover, right? And so if your brain is saying expect edges and you see something like this, rounded, right? Expect straight edges, and you see something like this, then the retina is going to send back an error signal that says, hey, things are not fine. We're not getting what you would expect to see. And that's when you see surprise. That's when you feel surprise and illusions and things like that. Okay, so great. All right, so I have. You like that one? All right, so I have a little bit of time. I'll try to move through this quickly, right? Well, I'll be fine. I have about 10 minutes. Is that okay? Ish. What's that? Perfect. Okay. So I'll try to be quick here. So I've given you the crash course in existential phenomenology. I'm giving you a crash course in a very narrow aspect of cognitive neuroscience. So what does the one have to do with the other? Well, I want to tease out this idea of what I would call the existential brain, or the existentially guilty brain. So I'll just put it all out there for my own benefit. All of that, I hope, makes sense, right? The idea that you move from sparse information, right, that you receive from the retina to a rich experience, which is this, right? Or you move from a model of how things are to a rich experience like this. But the idea is your brain is the thing that's providing that, right? Your brain is the one that's going through those inferences. But all is not well with that picture. Okay? Because the mind-body problem, as it was originally formulated, I shouldn't say as it was originally formulated, but in essence, by Descartes, which was basically, how is it that you get a lot of this sort of squishy matter together, and this squishy matter creates this, right? Why is it, if I crumple up, why isn't this conscious? If I I don't know, just like it's snacks, right? So if I go like this, why isn't this group of matter conscious? Hello, snacks, right? But this group of matter is, right? That's the mind-body problem. What is it about? Us, our brains, which produces consciousness? That still stands. It's still a problem. Okay, the mind-body problem is still a problem. It's still a problem in philosophy. It's still a problem in cognitive neuroscience, though whether or not they take up the problem is a separate issue. But we still don't know how to get from gray matter to consciousness. It's called the explanatory gap. Okay. I want to suggest that if you're looking for the brain to provide this, you're looking for the wrong thing. This is my argument. Okay. I want to suggest that if we are looking for, they're called the neural correlates of consciousness, we'll never explain consciousness, but we might, some people find neural correlates, which would be like, well, we know when this thing's firing in the temporal lobe, say this is what a lot of people think, that has something to do with visual consciousness. So activity in the temporal lobe is a neural correlate of consciousness. I can't explain why this leads to this, but it's a correlation. And then the idea would be, if we got enough of an understanding of all the things that need to fire, we would get a sort of sufficient creation of consciousness completely in the brain. That's the idea. I want to suggest that that's a wild goose chase. I want to suggest that the brain alone cannot produce consciousness. I like the brain is an important thing in consciousness. Neuroscience is an important field. We learn a lot from neuroscience, but I want to argue that all we will ever learn are necessary conditions. We will never be able, this is my argument, be able to get at all of the conditions that will produce this consciousness. And why? Because our brain is just as existentially guilty or party to the same things that we are. This is the argument, right? To be existentially guilty is to produce actions in a way that is fundamentally inadequate, right? And to produce intelligence in a way that's fundamentally inadequate, right? Well, that's no less true of God. You can't appeal to God to tell you what intelligence is. You can't appeal to reason to tell you what intelligence is. You can't appeal to human nature. And the idea is the brain isn't going to do it either. The brain is not going to produce intelligence either. Okay. Now, well, then what's the picture? What's the picture? The argument is, and this is where what Dr. Maher talked about comes into play. Embodied cognition comes in here. Okay. Embodied cognition comes in. Because I want to argue that the brain is necessary for consciousness and necessary for intelligence, but because of the fact that it's going to be inadequate, just like everything else, we need more. And this is where this idea of passive dynamics comes in. Okay, so this comes up with the phenomenon, right? That much of what you do that is intelligent, as you self-interpret, as you make your way through the world, much of what you do is the result of these passive dynamics. Okay, so a good example is this, and this is from Loeb and Getz. So it says, when standing still, okay, little or no ankle muscle activation is required to stabilize your body or your ankle joints. Okay, but now consider the problem of trying to stand on the dock of a boat, pitching back and forth. Okay, now you must apply large forces rapidly in order to pull the center of mass back from any direction. Ooh. Okay, by contracting, so here's the point, by contracting your ankle muscles, stiffen your ankle muscles, before those perturbations occur, before the rocking happens, you increase the stiffness at the joint. As a result, when the body is rapidly thrown in one direction, the muscles that normally pull in that direction suddenly shorten and their tension drops, but the muscles over here that pull in the other direction, they pull you back. Okay, so just by stiffening your joints, right, you can stay steady because of the passive dynamics of your ankle muscles. And the idea is that all happens automatically. We don't need to wait, here's the point, for like a conscious processing of information to stay steady on a boat, right? If you had to wait for a conscious processing of information to stay steady on the boat, like you had to think about what you're going to do and when the next thing happens, you'd fall over. All you have to do is stiffen your ankles and let the passive dynamics of what's going on down there take place, right? And another example, like the stretch reflex, right? The spinal stretch reflex. And the famous example is this one where they attack me. Right? But if you do this now, right, then what will happen is, and you let go, it'll fling back in a kind of overcompensating fashion, right? That is all happening as a result of stuff south of the brain stem. It's all in the spine. Okay, so it's a little more complicated than just the ankle muscles, right? But it's all in the spine. There's no computation involved in why this happens. Okay, so the idea is much of human intelligence, because of the existentially guilty brain, much of human intelligence is the result of a bunch of passive dynamics that operates anyways, okay? And that you don't need the brain to sort of make it happen. So, a classic example of intelligent action would be you throwing it and me catching it. So as I do this, right? As I do this, what's going on? Well, the brain, they've shown, is priming my grip aperture and grip tension ahead of time. So like, it's really interesting. If I reach for this, I'm glad you put this out. If I reach for this, right, and I just go in, right, before I get there, my grip is already shaped like this, and it's already primed to expect it to be light. So like if somebody played a joke on me and glued this, right, and I went like that, I would be surprised, right? But if I go for something much heavier, I'm not surprised even though it's heavy, right? So what's going on there? The brain is involved in priming that. it's priming the grip aperture, and it's priming the tension needed to lift it up. And that's all happening. But there's so much more involved in why this is going well than just that. There's the fact that I have a hand, for example, with this particular ligature and muscle strength and muscle tension, right? There's the fact that this, I mean, as soon as I touch this thing, it takes over. The brain doesn't need to tell me anything to sort of let this fall into my hand. It just falls by way of passive dynamics. That's the argument. Okay, so the idea is, if you're looking for the brain as the sort of seat of intelligence, as the thing that's going to do all the work of making stuff like this happen, or even stuff like this, right, the perceptual experience, you're not going to find it, because nothing works that way. We are all sort of fundamentally, when we try to do anything, we're relying on inadequate reasons. So there would be just another special case of existential guilt. Okay? The brain has to be an inadequate driver of our movements because everything is. That's the argument. Okay. And then real quick, the positive case. All right, and so this is where I can get really interactive and cool. Yeah. Global to local and local to global interaction. It's about as techie as I get. My students in my PowerPoints, they'd be like, they wouldn't understand. Like, I've never done anything like that. All right, so what's that? That's an example of global to local and local to global interactions. Global phenomenon are they take place over a larger expanse of time, okay? But they're a function of local phenomenon, which are they take place over a tinier amount of time, right? So the wave is an example of global to local and local to global interaction. Why? Because the global phenomenon is, of course, the wave as it travels around the stadium. So that interacts at the local level because those people were waiting for it, right? And they didn't go, like, nobody wants to be the jerk who goes early, right? They wait for it. And then, oh, we got to say that too for whatever reason, right? Okay, so do you see the global phenomenon influenced the local phenomenon, right? The only reason they went like that is because of the big thing happening. But obviously, the global phenomenon is a function of a bunch of local phenomena. The only reason that wave is traveling that way is because a bunch of people are themselves going like that. Okay, so that's the example of global to local interaction. Now, so, you know, the idea is phenomenal consciousness is a global phenomenon. Now, if I'm right, it's a global phenomenon that is the result of much more than just the brain. It's the result of you, for example, this experience, right, is a result of the brain, but it's also the result of you, my body, as Dr. Maher pointed out, you know, the fact that I can move my eyes like this. You think the fact that I can move my eyes has something to do with the fact that I'm consciousness? I do. You think I could be conscious without these eyes? I don't. This is the argument, right? So you need to be here in order for this experience to happen. My eyes need to be here in order for this experience to happen, and my brain does too. But the idea is the phenomenal consciousness, right, is the result of that big global phenomenon, right? Okay, I'm sorry. The phenomenal consciousness is the global phenomenon where those are the local things. Does that make sense? The phenomenal consciousness is the global thing, okay, is the big thing. So now, what does existentialism have to say about neuroscience? Well, it's got to do with this idea of global to local effects. We know this. So monks, for example, use the fact that they are phenomenally consciousness to control their body temperature, which obviously means they control their brain, right? And so they use the global phenomenon of their consciousness to control their body temperature. So there's famous experiments done like 20 years ago-ish, right? Where you wrap a monk in a cold, wet towel, and they will, through meditation, be able to make it steam after a few minutes and not be cold, and eventually, through meditating, cause their body and their brain to respond in a way where they heat up and the towel dries, right? Pretty amazing. So the idea is consciousness controls what happens in the brain. That's the idea, right? Epileptics, now this is a little shakier, but the idea is, in terms of empirically, but there's been at least special cases of epileptics who can control whether or not they have a seizure by certain conscious processes. So a lot of times epileptics, what brings on a seizure is something that it doesn't happen right away. There's like warning signs that it's going to happen. And one gentleman had his warning sign that he was about to have a epileptic seizure in a little bit was a olfactory hallucination. He smelled something that wasn't there, right? And what they did was they tried this where they got him as soon as he smelled the smell that meant a seizure was coming, is they gave him a strong contrary smell, like something real, and they said, smell this. It was a strong thing. It masked the smell that was the trigger for the hallucination or trigger for the seizure, and it prevented him from having the seizures. And then he got to it where he could just even say the word that referred to the smell. So it wasn't even the smell. It was just the thought of the contrary smell, and that would control the seizures, right? So that you see the point there? If the seizure is the result of local activity in the brain, then conscious experience can control that local activity. Okay, so that's just another example of global to local effects. And then where am I going with that? Well, we also know that moods play a role in cognitive function. So there's another piece of empirical data, right? Your mood plays a role in cognitive functioning. It's not hard to understand why, right? If you are people who are depressed, for example, have impairments in their executive function, right? They can't think as well because they feel depressed, right? And it also affects neural plasticity. People who are and depressed have less neural plasticity. So the idea is neuroplasticity, as you know, relates to the fact that your brain is always changing, always rewiring, right? I think when you learn a new skill and you get good at it, the only reason you get good at it is because you're rewiring the brain accordingly, right? So that's that. The fact that you can learn a new skill, like especially like a language, is evidence of neuroplasticity, right? So what does that matter for for what I'm trying to do? Well, I want to argue, and I don't know the answer to this, but I want to think about this. I want to argue that we can use what we know about being authentic to present a certain kind of neuroplasticity. So what I imagine is this, and this is open-ended. I'm not sure if this is going to pan out, but that's kind of the point, is to sort of go down these roads. What I imagine is this, or what I hypothesize maybe is this. What if we got somebody good at being authentic, and they were good at facing up to the anxiety of existential guilt and existential death, and they, as a result, learned to not only feel that anxiety that you get, but be okay with it and use it to their advantage, right? Well, the argument would be if they got into those moods and they got good at that kind of mood, right, then that would change their brain. And that would drive neuroplasticity in an interesting way. That's the idea. And so the idea would be using the fact that existentialists tell us how to be authentic and the fact that global to local effects occur to use existentialist ways of living to shape how your brain works, right? And I'll just end in this way. I want to say that you should be, students, interested in doing something like that. Because what do you think you're doing to your brain if all you do is act like everybody else? And all you do is behave inauthentically. And you don't seize specific opportunities that happen to you. And all you do is respond to the general situation in the general way. And then I get carbon copies of people, right? And maybe I get carbon copies of their brain function. Well, this is a wonderful thing that you have. And your ability to shape it is a huge responsibility of a piece with your responsibility to interpret yourself, you see? And so the fact that you are capable of being authentic, right, means that you are, I'm arguing, capable of shaping your own brain in ways that nobody has ever thought about. What could the human brain do with enough plasticity? I want to argue if we change this idea and we start to look for people who are authentic, they can shape their brains and we can discover that. All right, thanks everybody, appreciate it. Sorry if we don't. So I don't know if there are any, it's basically at time, but are there any questions? Anybody at home have a question on Zoom?
I just ask a clarification question on the existentially guilty brain. It's just not quite clear to me.
Right.
All right. So is it the idea just that the brain itself is not adequate to account for all the behavior that you're talking about? Is that what it means to be guilty?
Right. I want to think, here's what I'm thinking. I want to say that people who are under the illusion, I would argue, that the brain is the sort of source of intelligence are looking for the one and only thing that we need to look for to explain intelligence, right? And so it's of a piece with this idea that if I want to know what to do, I can look to the thing that's going to tell me the one and only thing I want to do. Reason, God, human nature, like that. And so the idea of existentially guilty brain, it's a sort of, it's a little bit of a stretch of that term perhaps, but the idea is you have to just face up to the fact that nothing is sufficient for explaining your behavior all on its own. And so if you're looking for that, you're looking in the wrong place. Does that help at all?
Yeah, so I have existentially guilty DNA too.
Right, exactly.
It's not, I can't blame my DNA, I can't blame my childhood.
Exactly.
I can't blame.
And I would say you shouldn't give your brain credit either. You shouldn't give your, the opposite.
Has.
Right? Like but people, it's very funny. Like you don't realize how scientists are informed by these presuppositions. The idea is something explains why I'm able to do this, right? Something explains why so I need to account for the intelligence of this, right? And I need to find the answer. What is the source of that? You need to face up to the fact that maybe there is no answer to that. Maybe there is no sort of causal basis for it. And it's certainly not the brain. I don't know. Is that yeah.
So kind of playing with that space, it seems like you could extend Heidegger's concept of thrownness to cognitive neuroscience and say at any moment, I am thrown with my perceptions in this moment. You're standing in front of the screen, so I can't see the letters. And no. But I can't see the letters of your name, but I infer them because I can figure that out. So the other piece that cognitive neuroscience would throw in is the guide that we have is statistics.
Right.
And just Bayesian learning is the absolutely amazing information source from thrown data.
Good. Yeah. So, and that's a technical question that he's getting into about, if you go back to, where is it? Top down versus bottom up stuff, right? So one view is, and this sort of speaks toward, and you can tell me if I'm getting it or not. One view of the kind of top-down processing, so remember what that is. The idea is you start with this model, right? You start with this model and you make predictions on the basis of this model. So, if I were to drink this, according to my model, it's going to be water in there. But if it happened to be something else, then I would be surprised, right? So the model sort of predicts, and I can think of what college students are thinking. But so the model predicts what, I was thinking Sprite. What were you thinking? So the model predicts that it's going to be water, right? And then on the basis of that prediction, I drink, and either it's what I expect or it's not. Now, here's the point. If it isn't water and it is Sprite, right, then either I have to do a couple different things. What the going view, this wouldn't work in this case, is I'd have to move. So I'd have to it doesn't work in this case because it's about taste. But one of the ways of changing unexpected sensations is to move your body. But another one is to update your model. And one of the ways that they do that is through this process of Bayesian inference, which is a form of updating your model accordingly, right? And so how does that enter into what I'm talking about? I want to say, right, that the kind of thing, I have no problem with the updating in terms of Bayesian, right? What I do have a problem with is updating it in terms of Bayes, where we read that as like a computation. It doesn't have, you can model the updating computationally without the process itself being a computation. I can model this by way of a computation, yes? I can say it's 32 feet per second, right? I can plot this on a graph. I don't think this is a computational process. It's just a water bottle problem, right? And so that's how I would treat Bayesian updating. It's a computational process, but it's a computational way of modeling a non-computational process. And I would capture the top-down stuff, not in terms of a prediction. I'm not going to talk that way because that's computational stuff. I'm going to talk about it in terms of priming. This is this idea. So the brain sort of primes me to expect water, okay? But it doesn't do it by sending out all these inferences. So there's a question of how to deal with Bayes' theorem in light of what I'm trying to say, and that would be the rough way to get it. I don't know if that helps. A little bit?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
All right. So my father is thrown at the present moment by dementia, but he studied physics at Purdue. So let me do my best to try to channel some of that. And so this notion of thrownness suggests a force, right?
Yes.
And a reaction. And so to the extent that someone is authentic, at what point is it that the force can the force become oneself?
Yeah, that's the point.
To influence the thrownness, and is it through that authenticity where you become the physics, you become the initial force?
Yeah, but you cannot escape your thrownness. This is the idea. So part of what it means to be existentially guilty is you cannot get clear of your thrownness. You cannot become so free that you step outside of the normative claims upon you, right? I cannot avoid the fact that right now, yes, various things matter to me that I've inherited from my past. I cannot get clear of that. I can pretend like I'm not a father right now, right? But I'm still a father. I can pretend like I'm not a teacher, but I'm still a teacher, right? So you cannot get clear of your thrownness. So being authentic means dealing with that fact in the best way possible, where that involves the recipe I was talking about, where you sort of face up to the fact that you are thrown and you can't get clear of your thrownness, and face up to the fact that you are always vulnerable to world collapse and existential death, right? And sort of, and the best you can do is be alive to those situations, be alive to both of those facts about you. And then the argument is, I will start to look at the world differently and see new possibilities there that weren't there if I'm being inauthentic and I'm just sort of pretending like I have a guide and pretending like, oh, I'm not going to die. It'll happen later, but I don't need to worry about it, right? So inauthenticity is a way of shirking your responsibility, right? And authenticity is a way of seizing the responsibility to be yourself, but you can't get clear of who you are. Does that help?
Yeah, so the authenticity increases the likelihood that I have influence over my future thrownness.
You always have influence over your future thrownness. It's just a matter of whether or not you take responsibility for that influence, right? If you live a life of conformity, students, that is on you. But seriously, if you live a life of conformity and the only thing you do is what everybody expects you in a general way, and that's how you live, then that is on you. That is on you. So it's always on you. You can't escape the fact that you must deal with yourself. If you go like this, I don't want to deal with myself. I don't want to, that's another way of dealing with yourself. Right? This is what it means to be human. So you, I don't know if that helps. Yeah. Yeah.
So just to clarify, because I've had to learn a lot of new words based on context clues today.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Thrownness are sort of these like imposed sort of internal elements that determine how you're going to react to. So like me expecting this mask to feel like a mask is a form of thrownness. Minor, kind of. Is that true?
No. So the thrownness is the fact that you have various obligations. So it's more basic than that. It's more generic than that, right? So the idea is the thrownness is the set of norms that you have inherited, right? Okay, whereby things matter to you or not. So if you are somebody who feels anxious about the fact that you don't or do not have a mask on, right? Then that is shaped by this normative claim upon you that has something like, well, I need to take the virus seriously. That's what we're doing right now, right? And so it's going to affect the general situation of so you're a student, right? Right? I had you in class over Zoom. It's nice to see the rest of your body. I'm used to just seeing this part of you, right? But the idea is, right? So by virtue of being a student, you have various obligations that are in place, right? And that will affect how you act, whether you reach for a mask or not. Does that help at all?
Yeah. One more thing. So the top-down versus bottom-up processing thing.
Right.
Is that? I'm terrible at wording things. I should.
You're not though. You carried the class, I remember.
Oh, okay.
You did. It was great.
Thank you. So that's sort of it's sort of related to this idea of how like oh boy, like reactions to things are not determined solely by bits of information that you collect and assemble into a larger picture. It's also internal bits that you sort of deconstruct and they sort of meet in the middle to form what you think about it. Is that
top down?
Like the top down and
versus bottom up.
Versus bottom, like both of those
Right.
contribute to the thought process and reaction, and they sort of meet in the middle to form what you're going to be. Like picking up the water bottle and expecting it to be heavy.
Right.
Your reaction to it not being heavy is determined by your notion that, like, preconceived notion that it should have been heavy, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So the preconceived notion makes predictions in the form of expectations. So I'm, oh, it's a water bottle right here. And so because I have a general understanding of this kind of scenario and this kind of thing, I have a memory. Just think that the top-down thing is the memory.
That's what I mean.
Right?
That's what
and the memory sort of makes a prediction about how things are going to be, right? And so what this is, sometimes they call it a controlled hallucination, because it's like my brain is creating this, right? Because this is all just a prediction about how things should be. This, okay? And then what happens is I act, and if I acted and this wasn't there, right, then the stimulations of not being there would send up to my brain and say, it's not how you expect. That would be bottom up.
Got it. So your sensation is bottom up. Your preconceived notions are top down.
Yeah.
Okay. That was my question. Thank you.
Yeah.
I know we're late on time, but we do have one question from the chat.
Good.
That I wanted to just pose really quickly.
Yeah.
It's from Molly McGrath. She says, very nice presentation. Thank you. I'm curious if you could explain more about the types of causality involved in the local, global, global, local example. They seem lopsided to me. The global is made of the local. In what sense is the local caused by the global? Is that in the sense of motivation or inspiration? And isn't the cause actually individual people's decisions? No?
Right. So the global to local versus local to global causation is it's a non-linear form of causation. So it gives up on this idea that you need to think about causation as a first this, then that kind of thing. It's a tricky metaphysical notion of circular causation. So and so when you can still think about things that are global and local in a kind of linear way, but it's always an abstraction. So a good example of this, just to illustrate the different kinds of causation and how it works, is think of like something like the digestive system. Okay. The digestive system, the behavior of the digestive system is a global phenomenon, but it's obviously a function of the local phenomenon, like what your small intestine is doing and what your stomach is doing, right? Well, now what happens is, right, the behavior of the digestive system is certainly a function of the behavior of your stomach. If you have an ulcer, right, then that's going to affect digestion. Yes. So that would be a case of local to global influence, because the ulcer in your stomach is going to affect the global phenomenon of digestion. But, and this is the tricky part, simultaneous with that local to global influence is global to local influence. And how does that work? Well, the only reason your stomach stays around is because you keep digesting things. If you stop digesting things, your stomach would eventually disintegrate. Right? So the only reason the stomach is there is because this process of a thing called digestion, the global phenomenon takes place. And so the understanding of the causation is really tricky, but it's the idea that you get rid of the idea, well, that first I need a stomach and then I digest, right? Or first I need to digest and then I have a stomach. The whole idea of this influence is that you need both simultaneously, right? And so what this does is, this global to local, local to global influence, is it gives up on this idea of cognition, which is first inputs, then outputs. Because you see how that would work? The idea would be, if perceptual experience is a result of these global to local to global influences, you can't say that first light hits my retina and then I see. Right? You can't say that, because that would be just one example of that would be one local thing reflecting the global phenomenon. But at the same time, the global phenomenon is affecting how the light strikes my retina. Okay, so it's a common thing in philosophy to do this, to treat perceptual experience as if it involves input versus outputs, first this, then that. But if you have this global to local versus local to global understanding of things, you do not speak about things that way. Now, can I, knowing that, talk about things where first I see the light and then I see the light strikes my retina and then I see? Of course I can, but that's an abstraction. That's something that I do, given my interests, right? Can I say something like, well, first you had the ulcer and then you had indigestion? Of course, I can say that, but that's my interest, right? And so what I want to argue is the idea that the brain is a sufficient causal condition for consciousness is an example of that kind of abstraction. What's really going on is you have local to global and global to local influence simultaneously. And what we want to do in neuroscience is get a handle on that. So what we do is we make an abstraction and we say, well, what's the brain got to be doing first to produce this? Or what does the brain have got to be doing first to produce this? You can speak that way, but it's an abstraction from the larger phenomena. So Dr. McGrath, I don't know if that answers your question.
She had said thank you earlier, so
yeah,
we'll say yes.
She's like, stop talking. She's like, stop talking.
There's been several people who had to sign off on the chat, and you received many compliments, and I'd like to add to that compliment. And I know some other students who are in this room that need to go to other applications. So I'm just going to close it for now. But please, if you have other questions, you can reach out to me, and I can forward them, or you can reach out directly. And I just wanted to say thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, students, for coming. It was quite a delight. I love it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.